Good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. Lots of interesting things unfolding right here in the nation's capital. We finally got the text of that border plus Ukraine plus Israel deal, and there is something for everyone to hate. Apparently,
Oh, yes.
we will get into what's in it and also its increasingly long odds of actually passing. At the same time, we're taking a look at the fact that AI is already taking white-collar jobs. In spite of the fact that tech has, in many ways, recovered this year, record revenues, all that kind of stuff, they are still shedding jobs, and AI appears to have a lot to do with it. We're also going to do a little review, possibly debate. I'm not sure about the Apple Vision Pro. Saagar and I believe have different assessments of the utility and the future of this thing. Jeff Stein is coming in studio to give us a breakdown on a very simple question. How is the economy? Actually, a very challenging one to answer.
I wish it was simple.
Yeah, it should be a simple question, but it actually is really not. We have an American general who is saying that Israel is completely failing in their stated objectives in Gaza. This comes as the U.S. has been caught lying about whether or not they actually gave Iraq pre-notification about those strikes over the weekend. And we're also taking a look at one provision in that border Ukraine-Israel bill that would permanently ban funding from UNRWA, that is the main aid agency on the ground, to benefit Palestinians, what that could mean, and also actually got a little bit of a look at what the allegations are. And let me tell you something, guys. Those allegations against UNRWA employees, completely devoid of any evidence. So a lot to get to this morning.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about everything for today's show. Before we get to that, though, we did have our RFK Jr. focus group that just happened last night in the state of Michigan. It was really interesting. We've already got some amazing results, and I think you guys are going to be really struck, and in some cases, honestly moved by some of the reasons why people support RFK. A lot of it having to do with just a rejection of the two-party system. So I think it's really going to resonate, and for our premium members, you guys get to watch it early, and you get to support work like this. BreakingPoints.com. We have a discount currently available for our annual members. But it's always good to hear from people directly, Krystal.
Yeah, absolutely. Griffin was there on the ground during the focus group, so he gave us a little bit of a preview of what to expect. And I'm personally really looking forward to watching it and hearing from these folks why they have decided to throw in with RFK Jr. And he also said they're very optimistic.
Yeah, very
optimistic that he could actually win and be the next president. So that'll be really interesting to listen to.
It's going to be exciting. I think you guys will enjoy it. We'll release it as a podcast, again, exclusively and early available to our premium members. So breakingpoints.com if you want to take advantage. But let's go ahead and get to the major news here in Washington. The border bill arrived and seemingly died upon arrival. It was negotiated by Senator James Lankford, Senator Kyrsten Sinema, and some Senator Chris Murphy as well from the Democratic side. Kyrsten Sinema, I guess, from the independent side. Shall we call it that, Krystal? And then we have Senator Lankford being from the state of Oklahoma. So Senator Lankford appeared on Fox and Friends yesterday morning to make his case for the bill and to rebut some of his GOP colleagues who preemptively were rejecting some of the details. Here's what he had to say.
He said no self-respecting senator should agree to vote on a 370-page bill this week. Any 41 senators can prevent the bill from proceeding. If you agree that senators should have this bill for at least a few weeks and certainly more than a few days before voting on it, say so. You understand where he's coming from, right? Don't you guys have a procedural vote this week? And you're going to vote on the bill by the end of the week?
So we actually have this bill came out yesterday, Sunday. The first procedural vote is Wednesday, and that procedural vote is literally just open it up to be able to go through it and to be able to say, are we going to debate it this week? That's what Senator Lee is actually talking about. It's interesting that he said he's already opposed to it. He needs 3 weeks to be able to read it, but he's already opposed to it. Again, people have got to be able to read it, go through it themselves. Don't just go off a Facebook post somewhere what the bill says. This dramatically changes asylum. It dramatically changes deportations. We no longer have a 10-year backlog. It builds more wall. Those are the key things that it actually does. But read it for yourselves. Don't just believe what's online.
Read it for yourselves. And many Republicans did and still have ended up rejecting it. We will get to that. But there's actually a good summary of this deal from Bill Melugin. Some of you guys may be familiar with him. He's the Fox News reporter who covers the border. He's very critical of the immigration situation and of Biden. So I think, his overall summary, I think you could take from the most skeptical point of view. We can go ahead and put this up there on the screen, and I'll read from some of it. So he says, quote, my initial highlights from the border deal. There's no amnesty and legalization of anyone already who is in the U.S. illegally. It funds an increase for ICE detention capacity from 50,000 4,000 from the current 34,000. There's a 7-day, this is the most controversial part, so please pay attention to this. At a 7-day rolling average of 5,000 encounters per day, or 8,500 encounters in a single day, the Department of Homeland Security, quote, would be required to shut the border down and turn away anyone who crosses. No new asylum claims would be allowed. Anyone crossing would be removed. It would end the idea of, quote, I made it to U.S. soil and you have to process me. That would be over. Border Patrol would not process an illegal crosser and they would be removed. No asylum claim permitted unless it was made at a port of entry. Pay attention to that because it's important. They then go on and they say, this does not mean that, quote, for, quote, 5,000 are allowed in. Before the authority kicks in, single adults would be detained. Families would be released via alternative to detention. Asylum cases would be fast-tracked to months rather than years under a new rapid expanded system. Those who fail would be quickly removed from the U.S. The initial pass would be reviewed from work authorization claims and 90-day supervision until final asylum claim is determined. Shutdown authority doesn't drop until the crossings decrease significantly in the days following that. Significantly, there are tougher asylum requirements and a highly credible fear standard, including the 3 bars to eligibility, criminal history, could they have resettled in another country on the way to the U.S., called a safe third country, and, quote, could they have resettled somewhere else in their own country? Just saying that you're scared to return home no longer is enough to be required in the initial interview. It appears that that legislation would then move asylum claim decisions away from immigration judges and have them be handled by USCIS, which is the U.S. immigration system. Next, they talk here about some of the increases to FEMA, humanitarian aid, increase in the number of new visas that will be granted over the last 5 years to 50,000. Funding, and this is another important part I want to pay attention to, funding to hire hundreds more ICE deportation officers, Border Patrol agents, and USCIS asylum officers. It says no unaccompanied minor could be removed, and some of these minors would receive attorneys pro bono and are taxpayer funded. DHS would take 90 days to have this new system before it goes into place. And the context that he adds at the end is that the border has seen at least 5,000 encounters almost every single day of the last couple of years under Biden. So if the bill were signed into law, the border would likely be shut down on the first day that it takes effect. So, Krystal, with all of that and with that skeptical summary, I think, here by the Fox News reporter, it does seem to still mean that almost all Republicans have rejected it out of hand. The House of Representatives say it's a non-starter and that it's not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear there. This is a bill that is very, pretty far in the restrictionist direction. It is not something that Democrats ever would have agreed to under Donald Trump or would agree to next time under Donald Trump. Historically, any sort of increased enforcement mechanisms have been tied in a quote-unquote comprehensive immigration bill with some sort of path to legalization. There is absolutely none of that there. There's a real, so I do want to say there are pieces of this bill that I would actually support, including, as we've discussed, I mean, one of the biggest problems is you have this massive asylum case backlog, millions of cases, so it takes years for these cases to be adjudicated. There are provisions in here that would help to expedite that and also would flood the zone with resources to help get rid of that backlog. I think that part is important. But there's also a sort of direct attack on asylum itself, making it much more difficult to claim asylum. It's already extremely difficult to be granted asylum. The bar is already extremely high. And then there's also, as we discussed before, this quote-unquote shut down the border, which is a little bit misleading how this is labeled.
I could not agree.
But basically the idea is once you get to over 5,000 on average on a daily basis, and there are some provisions in there like the president could change that authority, which is the other piece, is like you are giving the president, whether it's Biden or Trump, massive new powers under this bill. But the idea is once you get to that 5,000, you basically sort of like end due process and say, screw it to asylum whatsoever. So let me just talk about the politics, because in some ways what's in the bill isn't all that important, given that it doesn't have a chance in hell of passing. The politics here are that Trump basically came out and said, I don't want you guys to support this bill. And the Republican Party was like, okay, we won't. And so someone like James Lankford, who, took at face value the idea that the Republicans actually wanted a deal that combined border funding with Ukraine funding, with Israel funding, which was what Republicans were pushing for at the beginning of this process. Someone like him who, really tried to negotiate in good faith and really tried to give Republicans the restrictionist ideas that he wanted under the context of a Democratic administration. He's left holding the bag like, hey guys, I thought this is what y'all wanted. But, the politics at the end of the day rules the day. One more thing on the politics, because I think this is important. There is a lot of Democratic glee about, oh, Biden, he's so clever. Like, look at how he called their bluff. And now he's flipped the script on immigration. And now Republicans are, look bad on this. And they're exposed as not really wanting to be serious about this problem. I don't buy that analysis at all.
I totally agree.
I do not buy that analysis at all. Number one, the border, whatever's happening there is still happening on your watch. And, whatever I think of it, there are many Americans who find the chaos, and I think that's fair, who want to see an orderly border process, and that does not exist right now. That is still going to be the case. It is still going to be under a Biden administration, and so that's a problem. Number two, in the last election, Biden versus Trump, we had that prior to that election, we had the whole child separation policy, which Americans were genuinely horrified by. I mean, it was terrible. These kids who were orphaned by the United States government, the audio that was leaked of the Border Patrol agents mocking them, and all of that was horrifying. And Biden, in part to win a Democratic primary, he really positioned himself as being much more compassionate, of having this inclusive message about immigration, saying he would be a clean break from Donald Trump. And that ended up being a winning message. I mean, I'm not going to say that was like the number one reason why he got elected, but that was part of the appeal, is it would be a break from the cruelty and the chaos of a Donald Trump administration. What Biden and the Democrats have effectively done here is just embraced all of the Republican arguments on immigration, just completely caved and effectively said, like, you're right about immigration and your model is the right model. And guess what? If you want a border hawk, you are not going to defeat Donald Trump on those grounds.
Yes.
Like, why would you compete on who can be the biggest asshole at the border? You are not going to win that competition. So one of the basics of politics is to try to fight the fight that you want to fight on the grounds that you want to engage, where your strengths are. No, don't go to the place where he's the strongest, where if it's a competition of like who's going to be the most cruel and the most restrictionist at the border, there's no doubt that Donald Trump and Stephen Miller are going to win that all day long. So I think all of this celebration, oh, Biden's so clever, Biden's so smart, this was such a great ploy, is insane. I think it's cope. I think it's ridiculous, and I think it's foolish.
I totally agree on the politics. Disagree a bit on the policy. People can go watch some of our debates on that in the past. But yeah, I mean, listen, no matter what, like I'm a pretty strong immigration voter. I would say is one of the main, if anything still ties me to the main Republican Party, it would be immigration. Why would I ever vote for Biden? It's like one of those where if this is a policy where it's one of my number one issues, and why would I vote for somebody who consistently undermined the immigration policy over the first 3 years, got dragged here kicking and screaming, and is trying to do this for a political ploy, which, as you said, is not going to work. Now, I'll take myself out of it and just say, who are people who are voting on the border? If you are voting on the border, you're a Republican. Like, I just want to break it to you. You are the number one issue in the Republican Party today amongst the GOP primary electorate is immigration. Also, something else that has become very clear on the politics here, I'm curious what you think of this, is that in the past, excuse me, is that there was a major split on immigration in the Republican Party. Lindsey Graham, Marco Rubio, the Gang of Eight, by and large embraced in 2013 the idea of comprehensive immigration reform paired with some future border enforcement. Now, with basically the shutdown and the collapse of GOP support for even a bill like this, it basically means Trump has won the argument within the party. Even in this, it is over. The starting point for the Republican Party now is zero illegal immigration. Asylum itself, over. I support that, by the way, just so everybody knows, in terms of revamping our asylum process. But my point is that this view was a minority view within the establishment Republican Party. And the way that you know this, Krystal, is that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce endorsed this bill. It doesn't matter at all. Why did they endorse it? Well, because they like cheap labor, but that's a secondary part. My point is just that the establishment centers of power, the big business groups and others, which combined with the Koch parties I wouldn't say they had won the argument with voters, but they certainly had won with the establishment. To have a guy like Langford who comes from that wing of the party, who did, even he tried to negotiate something like this and it just be nuked outright, I think that demonstrates like a major shift in immigration politics, period. I also agree with you on the Democratic side, which is, and this is where I actually want to know what you think, because for me, under Trump, it was easy to scream about child separation, even though Obama did it too, and all of this, and then everyone just conveniently forgets that whenever it happens. But to me, the asylum and the images of the border under Biden just became so untenable within the system that they're trying to use past frameworks for the current problem where you have 6 to 8 million people that cross, under the Biden administration. It just seems to have collapsed within its own logic.
Well, I mean, the collapse is a long time coming and predates Joe Biden.
Yeah.
Because basically, I mean, to go back in some of the history of our immigration system, for a long time, the overwhelming number of people who were coming to America were single Mexican males who were coming for work. And there started to be a shift, largely driven, by the way, by our totally messed up foreign policy vis-a-vis Guatemala, El Salvador in particular, where these countries became incredibly violent and it was incredibly dangerous. And the number of people coming from those Northern Triangle countries spiked. We have not had a major overhaul of our immigration system since the early 90s.
Yeah, so we haven't updated asylum law since the 90s.
Exactly.
Right.
So we have a system that even at its, even when it was sort of reflective of the predominant type of migrant that was coming, it's not like it was working that well then either. And, it's never been updated to be able to process the number of asylum claims that are coming in. There's, always been this tension over, okay, who actually merits asylum. There's been a massive amount of discrimination between the types of migrants that will be granted asylum. For example, if you're from Cuba, probably granted asylum. If you're from Guatemala,
wet foot, dry foot,
you're not going to be granted asylum. If you're from Haiti, you're not going to be granted asylum. If you're from El Salvador, you're not going to be granted asylum. If you're from like a former communist country, escaping persecuted Venezuela, for example, you will be granted asylum. So it's always been very selective, very political, and largely broken, and the resources inadequate to deal with the number of people who come now claiming asylum. And that really is the core of the issue. Now, the other piece of the issue is, of course, just a question of like, okay, but how many people do you want to come? How many people is appropriate for, how many people? I think there's a practical consideration of how many people can be absorbed in a nation at a time, given the amount of resources, et cetera. My number for that is much higher than your number for that. That's where we just like wildly differ. I think we can agree on the need for the additional resources to process the claims, but when it comes to how many people should come into the country, I think we feel very differently about that. But with Joe Biden, what do I think happened that brought him to this place? First of all, I do think he had this idea of like, oh, I'm going to call their bluff.
Yes.
And it's an instinct that we have seen reflected in a bunch of European nations as well, among these sort of like center-left neolibs, where it's like, oh, the right is beating me up on immigration, so let me pretend like I'm on the right. And I was telling you there was a study that The Guardian wrote up recently that looked at whether or not that worked electorally, and they were like, no, it doesn't work. Because if people want an immigration asshole, then they're going to vote for the most, for the right-wing party. At the same time, you're demoralizing your own base. Biden, as we know, because of Israel and other issues, but in particular because of Israel, his base is already demoralized. This only further is like another thumb in their eye of, I'm going to be even harsher on immigration than Donald Trump was, and I'm going to completely flip from the messaging that I ran on back in 2020. So I think electorally, it's foolish. I think the other thing that happened, Saagar, is because you did have these, I think the project of busing migrants into cities.
Oh, it was genius.
I think that was very effective because it is true that, especially like a city like New York. Now, I think it's preposterous, the idea that a gigantic city like New York, a city that in a very short period of time in the last century gained 30% of its population and is a city of immigrants, can't handle absorbing 100,000 plus immigrants. I think that's preposterous. But if people are coming with zero resources all at once and no work permits even to be able to provide for themselves, well, yeah, that is a drain on resources.
Well,
that's
and they
a
have right to
difficult thing
shelter.
to deal with.
That's the main difference.
And they have the right to shelter. And so Eric Adams is going like, I need help. What are we going to do? And Kathy Hochul is the same thing. And Chicago mayor, same thing. And so I do think that also impacted some of the politics here of how we ended up in this place.
No question. I totally agree. I actually think that's probably the single most impactful thing. One of the reasons, again, why I think it collapsed on its own logic is Europe is a good example. So back in 2015, if people will remember, there was the great Syrian, Afghan migrant wave across Europe, some of which they're still dealing with today. They had the same level of asylum law that they had to grapple with, which is like, how much of this is real? Most of these guys are military-age men. What exactly does this all mean? Are they trying to stay here? Are they really fleeing for their lives? Well, also, they're from a war-torn country. Can we send them back? Like, what do we do?
Right.
And that led to, mean, the rise of places like Viktor Orban, Hungarian politics. I was just in Vienna and in Budapest. Both of them told me that the migrant crisis was the single biggest sea change in all of politics. It led to the first breakdown of the Schengen since the 1990s. It really undermined a lot of the internal logic of the European Union. Even today, there's some massive battles about it. And, Rishi Sunak, for example, he is under massive pressure from his right because of the asylum thing. Arguably, Brexit would not have happened if the German asylum invitee thing had nothing. So the politics of it, I think, really comes down to the fact that the law from the 90s was just not prepared for what the situation was going to be. I think we can genuinely agree. In terms of the policy and all of that now here, as I said, it has now been and shifted dramatically to the right for the Republican Party now. Depending on where you stand, I think that's a good thing personally, but it's an Overton window shift nonetheless. To underscore that, guys, can we put this please up on the screen? It's the actual whip list, which is the opposition right now to the Senate border deal. What we see here in the opposition right now, Krystal, is that you have 2 no votes, Bob Menendez, Alex Padilla. Actually, I believe Bernie Sanders
also a no.
has been added to that as well.
I think Markey and there's one more that I think there's 5 Democratic
right.
or Bernie's and independent no votes.
A lot of this is moving quickly, so we're doing our best. The reason why this is important is that right now it is going to be very difficult for this to even get to 60 votes. The reason why that would matter is that if it's at 60, then it can't even, if it doesn't get 60 votes, it will not even be able to get cloture. The secondary thing that is very important to understand here, if we could put A3, please, up on the screen, is that the House of Representatives has already declared, this is a joint statement from Speaker Johnson, Steve Scalise, who's the House Majority Whip, and Elise Stefanik, have all a statement that they've put out and say that the Senate supplemental says any consideration of this Senate bill in its current form is a waste of time. It is dead, capital D, on arrival in the House. We encourage the U.S. Senate to reject it. That, as I understand it, Krystal, is actually playing a huge part in undermining many of the votes in the Senate because many Republicans do not want to take a risky vote on immigration if they know that it's not. I mean, it makes sense, obviously. You don't want to take a bill. Already, Senator Lankford, by the way, is under massive fire amongst the GOP faithful from what I've seen. Trump basically disavowed him yesterday, even though, plot twist, he endorsed him. Also, many DeSantis voters are passing this around. In his endorsement of Senator Lankford, he said he's strong on the border. You can't even make it up.
I mean, but this bill is strong on the butt. Like, this bill.
Well, it depends on your perspective.
Compared to the status quo, if you're in favor of restrictionist immigration policies, this makes it much more stringent. It makes it, much more towards the Republican vision. And I have to say, for me, what this reminds me of is, I don't know if you guys remember, I know you remember, back in the Obama days when there was all this grand bargain, we're going to try to get a grand bargain, and which meant cutting Social Security and Medicare, basically. And Obama came to the table with a deal like, here, Tea Party, I'm going to cave to your wishes, and I'm going to put cuts to Social Security and Medicare on the table. And because they, I think it was probably some of the same logic of they didn't want to, quote unquote, give Obama a win. But also, the stated reason was like, oh, this doesn't go far enough and this doesn't do enough. So the Tea Party did, the work of people like me who don't want to see those programs cut and killed that initiative. And guess what? That never came around again. And so, I think, first of all, it's very uncertain whether Donald Trump is going to end up in the White House. I think it's a 50-50 prospect. That's number one. There's no way he's going to have a filibuster-proof majority and control of the House and be able to just do whatever he wants on the border. Now, he can do what he wants to do with executive action, but that's always limited.
Yeah, it's difficult.
Both in what you can do and also in the duration of how long that lasts. So if you actually want to, quote unquote, close the border and limit asylum and all of these things, this is probably your best chance under a Democratic president. Democrats, like I said, would never agree to something that was so enforcement heavy under Trump or under a Republican president. So I think this probably is their best chance if they actually care about, the restrictionist policies they claim to care about. Just to give you one example, this bill would more than double the budget of ICE.
Yes.
It would give the DHS secretary unilateral powers to deport as many people as he or she wants to deport. These are powers this is, again, from the Democratic perspective, why I think this is insane. Yes, you're giving these powers right now to Joe Biden and Joe Biden's administration, but if Trump wins, you're giving those powers to Trump and his administration. Are you really comfortable with that and the way that they would use those powers? So again, I think if you actually, back the rhetoric that they back and believe in a restrictionist policy, this is probably the best deal you're going to get. And I am incredibly delighted, especially when you pair it with Ukraine and Israel aid.
Well, yeah,
that they want to. Well, and there we can agree.
Yeah.
That they want to kill this thing and that it's quote unquote dead on arrival in the House.
I'll give you the case that I've heard, which is McConnell's an old man. He's either going to die or he's not going to be there very soon. And he's the only person who was Trump actually encouraged him to nuke the filibuster in the case of for border enforcement deal. If we remember, for the border wall, H.R. 2 already passed the House of Representatives. H.R. 2 goes much farther than this. I'm a very strong supporter of H.R. 2. I think it's a great bill on immigration. It completely reforms asylum in a very different policy, endorsed also by the Border Patrol Union.
By the way, this bill is endorsed by the Border Patrol Union.
That's why I wanted to talk about this.
Yes.
So I did some digging. I asked some of my immigration friends, I go, what the hell are these doing? Because I was like, this can't be real. Brandon Judd, who I know, by the way, Brandon was the head of the Border Patrol Unit. I used to work with him quite a bit in the past. So, Krystal, one of the reasons the Border Patrol Unit supports this is because it dramatically increases their pay. It's not just over asylum. But that's...
Yeah, but what they wrote in their endorsement is this gives us like the strongest set of tools that we've ever had.
That's true. Yeah, absolutely. No question. But again, my case, the case that I have heard from those who say is, look, Mitch is going to be gone. We already have the House. We've won the argument. Now the senators are going to vote the way that we tell them to. If we nuke the filibuster for, many Republicans who are not named Mitch McConnell are very open to nuking the filibuster. And they're like, we'll just pass our immigration bill. I know you're against the filibuster too. So
maybe, but there's no reason why you couldn't do that. You couldn't pass this bill and then still do that down the road.
I think
that doesn't foreclose the possibility to completely kill asylum down the road.
The DHS secretary, gets unilateral authority. Well, Republicans don't try. They're impeaching him right now because they say that he's not following the law. For them, it's actually one of the reasons not to give the power to Mayorkas or to the president.
It gives him unilateral authority to deport as many people as he wants to deport.
They think that number would be zero.
It's not like unilateral authority to give them amnesty. It just goes in one direction. So your worst case scenario is, the status quo.
Well, if you give somebody a work permit and you don't deport them, that basically is amnesty, because when the hell are they going to leave? I mean, that's kind of the...
But here's the thing, just on a substantive level, that I genuinely don't understand, and I want to hear your analysis of. Republicans, we've covered this on the show a bunch of times, talk about, all these people who are leaving New York, going to Texas, going to Florida. And that's seen as like, that internal migration is seen as like, I think justifiably so, terrible for New York and terrible for California and fantastic for Texas and fantastic for Florida. But suddenly when it's people who are coming from outside the country, even though they're also just human beings, and by the way, immigrants, like some of the clearly like hardest working and oftentimes most patriotic people you could possibly meet, suddenly when they're coming from out of the country, when they come to New York, it's like, oh my God, this is terrible for New York. So how is it that people leaving is bad, but also people coming is bad?
It's a philosophical difference, Krystal, which is that the first part, your people are lawful permanent residents and they're American citizens. And the people who are coming here are not. And in most cases...
But they could be.
Maybe, but they don't pay taxes.
If they're allowed,
most of them don't speak English.
But that would be an argument for a pathway to citizenship, to legalizing them, bringing them out of the shadows. Because the problem, and this is one of the arguments about like, oh, it depresses the wages. What depresses wages is when you have people who are not legalized, who are in the shadows, who are being paid under the table, oftentimes like less than minimum wage and not having to abide by labor regulations. What you're making is an argument for legalizing immigrants, for allowing in more legal immigrants versus having this massive shadow economy.
I actually don't support legalizing immigrants, and I don't support pathway to citizenship for the vast majority of people here. And I'll tell you why, which is that as fundamentally is a fairness issue. People like my parents spent years and tens of thousands of dollars on lawyers trying to get visas. They had PhDs and master's degrees. It's not that easy for people to get a visa to this country. You can ask anybody who's like me. I think it's bullshit, frankly, that you can just cross the border, just say, I fear for my life because El Salvador sucks, and you get to stay here and you get to work for 5-10 years, liably never leave. The other case, and this is, look, you can call me racist if you want. The vast majority of people arriving here have no skills. We're lucky if they have a 5th grade reading level in Spanish, let alone in English. They're not educated in terms of the jobs that they're going to take. I mean, is it really fair to depress like wages for the lower class Americans?
It doesn't, though.
No, but absolutely.
The research.
It's a supply and demand issue. It's basic.
It's your assumption is that there's some set number of jobs in the economy and that's it. End of story. It doesn't shift. So again, it comes back to, okay, then why is it a great thing for New Yorkers to be moving to Texas? Why is that great for Texas? Why isn't that them taking their jobs and depressing their wages and ruining their community, et cetera?
Many people in my home state of Texas would say it's ruining their community, and it is driving prices up because of the supply.
Yeah, but they brag about, all the moving vans coming here to Florida and to Texas.
Look,
but when it's American citizens coming from New York, then it's amazing and it's great for the economy, et cetera, et cetera. But somehow, even though it's just also people, they just happen to be coming from outside the country, then suddenly it's terrible. It doesn't make sense.
I just think there's a fundamental difference between a guy who makes $250,000 from New York and moves to Austin, who's paying taxes and can buy a house, than somebody who comes here with literally $0.
I think that's so classist. Because
but it's not classist. They're not. First of all, they're not from here, so they don't deserve anything.
Hold on, Saagar. Think about. But put aside who deserves what, et cetera, et cetera. Just think about the best interests of the country. Like, it's very clear that some level of immigration, and you can see it again when we're talking about internal migration, is very good for local economies. And you know what? What we have seen as a nation of immigrants is that in these subsequent waves of immigration, some of the hardest working people, most family-oriented people, et cetera,
absolutely,
and more law-abiding, by the way, are immigrants.
Depends on the type, but yes.
Nope, not true. If you look overall, immigrant populations more law-abiding than native-born citizens, not to mention, yes, when they first come and they're learning the language and they're new, et cetera, and they're bringing their cultures, we all know what the next generation looks like. They just look like Americans. Their kids are going to speak English. They're going to be 100% American.
Well, it depends. Look, George Borjas, who works over at Harvard University, has done a 2017 fantastic study which shows that mass illegal immigration largely depresses wages for lower-class Americans. So that's number one. I would say the empirical data is pretty set on this in terms of the laws of supply and demand. But number two, again, is a deep philosophical difference. I think that the net migration level that we should have over the next 30 years should be zero. And this is my case again. And look, people will be like, how can a guy, son of Indian immigrants? By the way, my mom vehemently disagrees with me if anybody wants to know. And she also votes, so she can vote the way that she wants if people want to know. I'll tell you, which is that in the 1919s and the teens, we had a hyphenated American crisis, very similar to the one that we have here. Mass internal strife, complete differences of opinion. People speaking German, people speaking Italian. They had dual loyalty to their old countries, as we saw during the First World War. It was a huge problem. We had a massive foreign-born population equivalent only to today. Internal strife was solved one way. We dramatically lowered the level of immigration. We let people assimilate into the country. And for the next 40 to 50 years, we had very, very little immigration. Now, that is my case for us becoming a cohesive nation, which can have a true national identity, and one where the foreign-born population, where it is currently at an all-time high, should not continue to be higher with an orderly process. I will also say many Indians will be pissed off at what I'm saying, because I'm also claiming that legal immigration should go to net zero. And I strongly believe it, because I do believe that our current sovereignty and internal politics is so divisive, largely because we do not relate to one another whatsoever. And
that really has nothing to do with immigration.
The third world is just not going to work.
Even if you look at the political divide, has never been actually less racially polarized than it is right now.
Sure.
And in fact, Republicans are winning. This is the other thing with all this great replacement. Oh, they want to bring in all these immigrants just so they can vote for Democrats. That's actually happening less and less. And Republicans love to brag about how they're winning over this population, but also fearmonger about how they could never win this population. So that's another part of the conversation that I think makes absolutely no sense and is utterly ridiculous. The divide in this country, yeah, some are, there are some racial divisions, but increasingly we're actually less polarized among racial lines. And, I would wager, and I think most people would agree, that ultimately the country was much better for those waves of Irish and Italian and Polish and German immigrants. I mean, that's part of what has made this country what it is. And I don't see this new wave of migrants coming from a different part of the world in any different way. So listen, is there a limit to how much we can, bring in at one time? Just again, practically, if you flood the zone with a whole bunch of new people and that creates housing, there's problems. I'm not going to say that there's you can just bring in the whole world and it's not going to cause an issue. But I do think that there's something fundamentally broken in a logic that would say, it's very clear when a place like the industrial Midwest empties out and these towns are decaying and people are fleeing. It's very clear that's a bad thing. It's very clear when it's New York and people are leaving New York that that's a bad thing. But then somehow, when it's other people who are coming in, which in a different scenario, if they, came from a different country, a different part of the world, you say, this is great, this is wonderful. Somehow that's terrible. It just doesn't make any sense to me. And I don't think that the studies back up. The studies show that if you have a massive undocumented illegal workforce, that can be a problem for wages. Actually, documented immigrants, the overwhelming majority of studies show it's actually good it's neutral on wages. In general is good for the economy and helps for the thriving of that local area. So that's why, again, I'm not like open borders, just, let's have an unlimited number. But I think we can handle a lot more than we have. I think it'd be good for all kinds of people, all kinds of parts of the country. And I also just think it's fundamentally goes against some core American values, this complete attack on the asylum process and this idea that we don't care if you're being persecuted. We don't care if you fear for your lives. We don't care if you're a Jew trying to escape Nazi Germany or whatever.
Well, that's not fair.
It is. If you're ending the asylum process, it is.
These people are not fleeing Holocaust.
Yeah, but
okay?
no, but some people no.
They're fleeing gang violence.
Yeah,
by the way,
but hold on.
Okay.
But if you end the asylum process, you are telling people who would potentially be fleeing a Holocaust, we don't care. That's too bad. We're full.
What we could say is if there's a future Holocaust, then sure, on a case-by-case basis, we can evaluate what's going to happen. And again, I would even say is that El Salvador. Let's currently look. Everyone likes to talk about root causes. Well, what just happened? We just had a mass election of a right-wing authoritarian president who threw all the criminals in jail and dramatically lowered their murder rate. That proves they are adults with agency. They can elect leaders who want to deal with their problems and deal with their own problems and stay where they are. El Salvador's problems are El Salvador's. Venezuela's problems are Venezuela's. Has it been exacerbated by U.S. sanctions? Sure. But at the end of the day, it's not our problem. It's not our fault that if your country sucks, it's your responsibility to fix it.
But see, I just look at this totally different. I mean, first of all, we can't exempt ourselves from the foreign policy that we, up till very recently, were, screwing over these countries, or the drug war that is one of the, most critical root causes in making many of these places incredibly violent. But even if you put that aside, like I said, I don't see this as a punishment. I think if you look at it through another lens of, typically it's a great thing when people want to move to a place. When they want to move to Florida, somehow it's a great thing. When they want to move to Texas, somehow it's a great thing. So I don't see this as we're being punished by having to clean up other people's messes. No, I think we should have a process that's orderly. I think we should have enough resources to be able to deal with the number of people that are coming. I think we should have an ability, a system that makes sense, that lets in a certain number, that's not going to overwhelm the entire country. But we should, in general, see it as a good thing that people want to come to the United States of America and still see it as the land of opportunity.
You should see it as a land of opportunity. It should be. It should be a land of opportunity for people who live here and people who are natural-born U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residents.
But that's the thing is you see this as a zero-sum game, and it's not. It's not.
Like I said, there's a lot of data to back it up. Now, in terms of the difference between the Irish and the German is we were a rapidly industrializing economy which needed cheap labor. I would also say that a lot of people who were natural born hated the Irish and the Germans with some good reason because they were depleting their wages and were willing to work for much less than they were, and they were driving around their overall wages, which led to major labor disputes even within unions at the time. So that played out 100 years ago, but that was 100 years ago, and we can say what it is. Today, we are not a rapidly industrializing economy or a rapidly deindustrializing economy. We don't need a lot of cheap labor. The predominant amount of cheap labor that does come here and ends up work in places like home health care space. They end up depressing wages in places like construction and others. And there's also, we have a housing supply issue. I mean, where are these people going to live? But then, look, this is why I don't even like to have an economic argument as much. It's about process and it's about legality. For example, and you're using the ones about El Salvador, why is it fair that we invaded Iraq and Iraqis can't just walk here? Don't they have more right to live here than anyone in El Salvador? I would say, yeah, absolutely.
I would let them in too.
But it's not fair because they can't walk here across Mexico.
We do have special programs for, I think, Iraqis, but definitely Afghan interpreters as well who helped us in our war.
Helped
so
us,
absolutely,
that's the clarity. But not every random Iraqi who happened to live in the country between 2003 and 2020. It's just not. It's not a fair process that just because you can walk across Mexico, or if you're some Chinese or Haitian or whatever, that Somali or whatever however you can afford a ticket to there, that puts you ahead of the line. And the reason that these are all men is because it is based upon a belief that you can come here, you can Western Union your money back, and most of these countries, just so people know, huge portions of their economy come from illegal labor and Western Union transfers from the United States. They're called remittances. There was a huge effort in the Trump years to try and tax remittances, which of course the Republicans quashed, but it's secondary for the conversation right now. My only point is that it has to be orderly. I think we agree. But on the net benefit, I totally disagree that a bunch of people who cannot even speak English, the vast majority of these people, some of them don't even speak Spanish.
Listen,
I think a lot of people don't understand.
This may be controversial on the left. Like, I don't actually have a problem with part of the citizenship process being a requirement to speak English. So make that a requirement. I mean, that's the thing is you can't say.
But that's citizenship. I'm talking about living here.
But you can't say you have to follow the process. But then there is no process to follow and be like, also, I'm going to make sure that there is no process to follow. I just, I think that's fundamentally unfair. And, the other thing is, like, there's this assumption that everyone in the world would come to the United States of America.
A lot of them would.
And that's just not borne out by the data. Even among, there's a lot of focus on the, like, Central and South American migrants who come here. There's far more Venezuelans who have migrated to neighboring countries to Venezuela than there are who have attempted to come here. People typically, they want to, if they're under pressure, first of all, most people don't want to leave their homes. And I think anyone out there could relate to, like, you like where you live, you have a certain level of comfort, like you want to stay in your home. So already, if you're like, I have to migrate, this is a pretty extraordinary circumstance. Then most people, the overwhelming majority of migrants, are looking to go to the countries that are most proximate, where, again, they may have family ties or it just may feel more comfortable for them or whatever. So it's not true that if you, open things up that literally everyone in the world would want to come here. That's just not the way it works.
Well,
so, to your point about, like, oh, it's not fair that Iraqis can't come. Like, okay, so let's get them plane tickets.
Right, but they can't. That's my point. And look, Gallup survey, 2021, 900 million people would migrate to the West if they could. Sorry, that's just not going to happen. And this is the same thing whenever it comes to asylum.
I'm not arguing that we should just, like, let an unlimited number in. I just think the focus only on restrictionism. And here's the other thing that I'll say is there's this assumption that the more cruel and restrictive you are at the border, number one, the more orderly it's going to be. That's not true, because almost definitely the more that you're squeezing the number of actual legal migrants, the more you're going to have illegal migrants, because these are not people who are, like, casually leaving their homes. They have, real reasons and are not going to be and haven't shown any deterrence based on the cruelty at the border or the restrictionist policies at the border. I'll give you a perfect example. After Trump instituted the child separation policy with these dramatically cruel images, I mean, some of the most, like, cruel imagery you could possibly imagine coming out, the number of migrants actually went up. There has been no evidence that the more you crack down at the border, that it actually serves as a deterrent effect and people don't come. That simply has not worked out in history. So even if your goal is, like, let's keep people away, the restrictionist direction isn't effective for that.
The counter to that is that the reason they started coming back is because Trump caved and he actually went away from family separation. And he basically reverted back to the original policy. The one time it worked was during the pandemic when we didn't allow people to cross illegally, period. And you have to stay in Mexico, which I support that policy. But
that didn't mean that people weren't coming. It just meant that they were being dealt with at a different point.
Yeah, and that's great.
And the Remain in Mexico policy I have some issues with, but the general principle of we should have structures and bureaucracy in place so that the whole of the issue isn't being dealt with at the border, I do think actually makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. There was a Trump policy at the time, which Biden did away with, which encouraged people to apply for asylum in their home country at the U.S. Embassy if they wanted to. Unfortunately, that policy was done away with, which I don't support.
There was also a Biden policy that would use this CBP One app or something like that would allow people to apply in their home countries, which also was incredibly effective and which Republicans have, one of the things that they're citing as a problem here is that it would enable that program to continue.
I am not saying the Republicans have been perfect on this issue. In fact, they've been complicit and in many cases have abetted this because it's good for big business. In terms of the wage theory. So That's what I would say. I am not a Republican stand here. I'm purely representing the interests, I guess, of Mr. Saagar and Jetty. From my, again, I think philosophical difference is that I think mass illegal migration is bad. I think mass migration net is also bad for the United States. The foreign-born population is far too high. We need a long period of assimilation and of a strong social safety net policy. And I firmly believe that overall, that this type of unmitigated control and all that actually does a great disservice to people like my family and others who came to the country legally, and it is an unfair policy.
You had the ability to.
Yeah.
And your family had the money
that's
to.
Right. That's right.
And
yes.
that's
not unfair.
How is that fair? How is that fair that because you had the resources to do it and you happen to be from a country where there was a possibility of getting in, that you're able to?
Well, first of all, nobody owes anybody. So in terms of policy, it makes sense that you probably want people who are higher skilled, who already speak English, and who are well educated, so they can more firmly and easily fit into the overall economy.
See, I don't really
that's number
accept
one.
that.
Well, but that's a difference. And then I don't think anybody has a right to come here.
So
and in fact, my net is that nobody has a right to come here.
Here's what I would say.
Yeah.
I do think mass illegal migration is a problem.
Yes.
Not knowing who's coming in, having chaos at the border, having people who are being paid under the table, and who could, because they're working in the shadows, that can depress wages, no doubt. That is for sure an issue. Having a, significant level of legal migration where people have a path where you can put the requirement, okay, they have to speak English or whatever. I think that is net, and throughout history has shown to be net beneficial to America. I think it's a core part of why America has been as, economically successful and as vibrant and thriving and innovative as it has been throughout history. So I just, and there isn't evidence that legal immigrants negatively impact wages for anyone, as I said before. So as a population, they tend to be overall more law-abiding. That's what the numbers show. Tend to be some of the hardest working people in the entire country. And actually, oftentimes tend to have a lot of conservative values that Republicans are excited to, crow about and try to win over when it's convenient for them politically.
No question. You're right. I think immigration has obviously been a net positive to America. Wouldn't be here without it.
Yeah.
Throughout the past. But I would also, again, I would say that periods of great migration were also followed by periods of great shutdowns. And I think there was deep wisdom in that because it allowed for assimilation. It allowed for the benefit of that industrialization before we had overall changes to our laws, the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, which by and large has not changed and I think dramatically should change. We currently have a chain migration-based system where if you happen to have a relative here, it's easier to migrate, which is nuts because it also be merit-based, which is what I support.
I don't think that's nuts. I think it makes sense that if you have,
that's the
this
difference.
is again like a tradition in America is if, people who are in your family come and then they sort of set up and then you have a support system that
just
you can
because
come
it exists
and tie
doesn't
into.
mean it's good.
I think to me, it makes some sense.
Sure. I mean, look, it has its proponents. That's why it's been the law of the land for the last 50 years. What I would say is I think we should move like Australia, Canada, and many other Western developed countries to a dramatically merit-based immigration system with a point-based in terms of the criteria that we've talked about, being able to speak English, et cetera. But that belies the fact that it's not going to be fair. It's not fair because immigration shouldn't be fair. Not everybody should have an equal right to immigrate or go anywhere. And I don't have an equal right to set foot in any country. Whenever I go through passport control, any country in the world can deny me if they want to. I don't have a problem with that.
But Saagar, the
I
reality.
go to Poland or whatever.
The reality is because we are relatively well off and American, we pretty much can go wherever we want.
Mostly,
we
yes.
pretty much can go whatever we want. So what you're advocating for is a policy where basically like rich people can come and poor people can't. And I, even outside of the fairness, I don't actually think that is the ideal migration system because again, I think it's classist. I think it ignores the skills and the abilities that, people who happen to have been born in the wrong country and to the wrong set of parents that they can bring to the table. And I think that's demonstrated by the strength of America through migration throughout our history.
My care for the poor and the lower class extends to the borders of the United States. For everybody beyond that, I hope for the best for you, but it's not my problem. And that can sound harsh if you want, but I've seen enough of the world to know that there is so much suffering that is out there that there's absolutely nothing I can do about it. My parents are from India. I feel no obligation to street urchins in India. I think that's the Indian government's problem. I think it's really sad bad. I've seen a lot of them, in horrible sanitary conditions. But I believe that the number is so vast and so grand that there's a certain hubris to the extent that we can think that we can extend those rights and benefits to everybody.
And that's where you and I are just fundamentally different. Because the fact that we can't solve every problem for every person in the world does not harden my heart to being able to do what we can within the bounds of things that, again, are actually good for our country and have been shown to be good for our country over time. And the last thing I'll just go back to, it doesn't make any sense to me that when New Yorkers are fleeing to Texas, oh my God, this is terrible for New York. But when migrants who, again, over time, law-abiding, more law-abiding than the native-born population, hardworking, have gone through hell in order to get here, are going to probably be way more patriotic than your average American. But when they come, suddenly it's a disaster and it's terrible for the state. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Well, public opinion doesn't agree with you. I can at least say that.
I don't know about that. I think there are a lot of Americans who are very committed to the basic concept of America as a nation of immigrants who, this is, again, Biden ran on this last time around and he won the presidency. And I think it's foolish for him to completely abandon the more inclusive messaging, not, any sort of radical open borders thing, but to the more inclusive messaging, values-based messaging that helped him win the White House. I think it's a dramatic political mistake.
We'll see. We've been going for an hour, I believe. So if people want to leave a comment and let us know, I hope that it was worth the time. I think it was valuable. I think people should be able to hear these different perspectives. Shall we move on to Israel?
Let's talk about this. We may have more agreement on.
Oh, there's going to be a ton of agreement here. So Senator Chuck Schumer, and if we shouldn't forget, we just did this long discussion about the border bill and why we have disagreements about it, but about why it's dead. Now let's move to the areas of the border bill which were paired with military aid to Ukraine and to Israel. Senator Schumer had a stunning pronouncement on MSNBC yesterday in his advocacy for the bill, where he said that if the bill is not passed and money is not given to Ukraine, America will regret it because then American troops will have to be sent to fight in Ukraine. Here's what he had to say.
Well, if we don't aid Ukraine, Putin will walk all over Ukraine. We will lose the war, and we could be fighting in Eastern Europe in a NATO ally in a few years. Americans won't like that. If we don't help Israel defend itself against Hamas, that perpetual war will go on and on and on. If we don't help humanitarian aid to the starving Palestinians in Gaza, hundreds of thousands could starve. And the border, everyone has said it's chaos. You just saw Speaker Johnson. He said it's chaos. We have to do something legislative a few months ago. But what has happened, in answer your question, so this is crucial for America. It's a turning point. History is going to look over our shoulders and say, did we rise to the occasion? To his credit, Mitch McConnell did. But too many Republicans, including Speaker Johnson, are just scared to death of Donald Trump.
It is insane that the way that they act like they would have no choice in the matter.
I know.
But to send our sons and daughters to die in Ukraine if you don't give them even more money than they've already given. And you know what's amazing in this bill that I think it was Michael Tracy that pulled this out? One of the provisions of the bill is that the Ukraine funding includes that we have to come up with a strategy for Ukraine for the future.
Yes.
It's like, wait a second. Aren't you supposed to have a strategy already? We've been at this for years at this point, and you're admitting you just literally have no strategy for how this is going to end?
Guys, we actually have that. Can we put A7, please, up on the screen? I will read directly from the text of the bill. He says that the House of Representatives will have a strategy regarding the United States support for Ukraine against aggression. That such strategy must be provided for a multi-year, establish specific and achievable objectives, define and prioritize U.S. national security interests. This will hasten Ukrainian victory against Russian invasion forces. I do want to spend time on this because it's one of the most dishonest things that people who are pro-Ukraine say. They're like, well, if Ukraine is defeated, then American troops will have to fight. Why? Ukraine's not in NATO. It actually doesn't change anything. If Latvia's invaded, then yeah, that's a different story. Then yeah, we would be in a fight because they're in NATO. Ukraine's got nothing to do with NATO. Ukraine is a former Soviet state, which has no security obligation, zero from the United States. I would also say it is the most stupid argument because it's one of those where it's domino theory in reverse. For example, Krystal, currently the line is to support Taiwan, we have to support Ukraine. And the reason why is because if Ukraine falls, then China will be emboldened to support Taiwan, to invade Taiwan. And my friend Elbridge Colby always points out, if you think Taiwan is under threat, then you should support weapons to Taiwan and more Navy destroyers in the South China Sea. That has to do with Taiwan. But don't try and do all of this convoluted jujitsu about, well, if this happens and this may happen, which may, invite somebody to do this. No. Make the argument on its face. And the reason they can't is because the Ukraine war is a failure and a disaster. Since the day of that spring offensive, if you want to call that, from the Ukrainians, they haven't advanced a single inch of territory. They have squandered probably up to 1 million of their own citizens. They are currently undertaking a draft, which includes people who are blind, disabled, and barely functional in their 50s, throwing them into a meat grinder.
So sad.
Begging us for more bullets as they sacrifice their own people. And at the same time have been completely militarily inept to apply any tactics that have even remotely worked in retaking their territory. It's their fault. They decided not to take that peace deal back in 2022. Many supported also by the United States. And now the two of us are in this, death grip where we're watching the failure of our policy just go apart. Zelensky, by the way, I should say, is in free fall. He's firing his top commander. Why? Because the guy admitted to The Economist that it's a stalemate. That's why he's firing him. He's,
for the crime of being honest.
The crime of being honest. He's firing many top ministers. He's finally allowing some of the tip of the iceberg corruption to come to light. Who knows how many billions were squandered and were stolen, by the Ukrainian oligarchs now at this point. The only humanitarian thing and strategically important thing you could do would be to sue for peace as soon as humanly possible. But honestly, at this point, they have squandered their chances such that the Russians just yesterday retook a city. If I were the Russians at this point, because America is so distracted in all this thing, I would take the whole thing. I would roll through the whole country as much as I could. And it's their own fault that they got themselves into this position. Good luck with your drones and your F-16s and all of that. It's about men, it's about bullets, and you were never going to be able to do it.
I mean, it's really our fault too, though, for pushing them into this war and giving them all the assurances that we would be there forever and we would back them forever and give them what they needed in order to succeed. So, I mean, our hands are incredibly bloody with this entire conflict. And so I do think it's very revealing that within this document, within this bill, pledging additional support to Ukraine, it's like, oh, and let's also come up with a strategy. The only strategy at this point is how do we possibly get to another place where there can be negotiations and diplomacy, because that's the only way this is going to end. And right now, it's already a complete disaster. We already missed the best moment that would have achieved for Ukraine the best deal that they were possibly going to get out of this situation. Right. That's just the sad truth.
Absolutely. And, and then they can't complain is that, oh, we sacrificed so many people. It's like, well, welcome to the logic of the First World War. You should have tried to settle it whenever you could.
Sad.
You should have listened to the wrong guy.
Honestly, it's heartbreaking.
On Israel as well, there's just, you can't even make some of this stuff up. Let's put this up there on the screen. Again, flagged by Michael Tracy. He says and points out, all of the $17 billion appropriated for Israel in this bill, any congressional notification requirement applicable to funds made available under this heading in the Act for Israel will be waived if the Secretary of State determines so in the national interest of the United States. In other words, it specifically exempts Israel and Ukrainian funding from congressional oversight, meaning that you are not allowed to, as we saw in the past, ask any inquiries about corruption, ask any inquiries about whether this is compliant, this military aid, with U.S. law, like, for example, violating the Leahy Act and not being misapplied against civilian forces or any oversight whatsoever. So what is the point? Imagine Congress coming in and being like, we want to abdicate our responsibility. But it actually makes sense because they don't want to know what the money and the weapons are being used for. They just want to turn them over and then look the other way and just pretend that it doesn't exist.
It's just codifying what has already been reality with this White House, because we've covered how multiple times they've skirted congressional authorization to rush through. They've skirted their own State Department policies to rush through whatever weapons shipments that they want to. So this is just codifying what has already been reality and what the overwhelming majority of members of Congress have already accepted. And to that point, put this next one up on the screen, it also has a provision here that would skirt any authorization debate about the ongoing U.S. operations in the Red Sea, in Iraq and Syria by simply handing over $2.4 billion to cover those operations, no questions asked. So they wouldn't have to go to Congress for anything, wouldn't have to go, even to ask for additional money to continue these illegal operations, bombing 3 different countries. This would, tie that up with a bow as well. And by the way, kudos and great thanks to Michael Tracy for reading through the entire bill and pulling out these key provisions, which of course were not getting covered by the mainstream press.
No, I didn't see a single, everyone's focusing on the border shit. Sure, we did too. We did a whole hour on it just this morning. But guess what? It's not the only thing that's going on in there. All of this is what the national security complex, this is their thing of wildest dreams. Free money, no oversight. It's like the continuation of the Pentagon budgets. And just think about it too. When you fund a foreign war, you may want to know what's actually going on inside of that war instead of issuing empty threats like Senator Schumer did in the beginning. Let's move on now to the discussion around AI. This is something, Krystal, which, by the way, we answered a question in our AMA about UPS workers. There was a major story about how UPS is laying off 12,000 people. Now, many people were anti-union, picked that up, and they were like, see, they had to fire a bunch of people after they negotiated a contract. Guess what, though? It turns out, let's put this up there on the screen, that many incorrectly assume this is going to affect delivery drivers. No. It turns out that the larger group, quote, of white-collar workers are being fired because UPS is now testing artificial intelligence and machine learning tools, ramping up its use of both across enterprise. This fits with larger firings that are happening all across the white-collar market, most importantly in big tech. Let's go to the next one there, please, because what's very important is this question. Why is big tech still cutting jobs, as they flag in the New York Times? The economy's doing well. Their stock prices at all-time highs. Meta stock just made records, all these others. So what's happening? Well, what they say is that instead of hiring thousands of people every quarter, the companies are now spending billions to build AI technology they believe could one day be worth trillions. Not only that, they're not only investing in AI, Krystal, they're in many cases are trying to replace as much as their workforce. The reason we're flagging this is that this is just totally counter narrative to the 2010s discourse around AI and around machine learning.
Yeah.
Everybody assumed the truck drivers would be first out of work. Oh, it's actually the truck drivers who are getting paid and still have their jobs. It's the white-collar supply chain logistics guy who was directing routes from one place to the other, which was automated out of business in a matter of 2 years after the invention of this technology, which is stunning. I mean, it's totally counter to the way that everybody expected the economy to go. And it does show us, I think a white-collar apocalypse is absolutely on the horizon. Like a decimation of HR, anything low level, starting out, things that are, Excel jockeys and all that stuff is going to be gone.
Yeah.
It really is.
All that can be automated already.
Easily.
Some of the harder things to automate is like care work, some of the manual labor that really requires the human touch. The whole delivery drone idea hasn't worked out, right? You still need all those. You still need those delivery drivers, exactly. It's ironic because it is the opposite of what people were originally thinking. They were originally thinking that blue-collar workers would be hit hardest. I do think there's still some risk for truck drivers based on California and Texas and some of the autonomous vehicle technology and the development of that, although it appears to still have some major issues, but there's still a push in that direction. But I do think that this is really a harbinger of things to come. And in many ways, this so-called apocalypse is already upon us, given the fact that, the tech companies, many of them struggled last year, and revenue was down, and there were mass layoffs. Many of these companies had massively staffed up during the pandemic because, of course, there was like a tech boom during the pandemic years. They had way too many people on board. Then when, people went back to more normal behavior and there was a loss in their revenue, they had to adjust. Well, now revenues are back up. Many of these companies are doing extraordinarily well, and yet the layoffs in some instances continue. And it's not because they can't afford to hire the people. It's because they would rather have a robot who, can't call in sick and doesn't have all the human being issues and may be faster ultimately depending on the task and more efficient than the human being is. So they'd rather move in investing in that direction than investing in human capital.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, to consider the layoffs. Let's go to the next part where we have a slide here which shows all of the companies that have had mass layoffs in 2024. You'll notice names like Salesforce, you'll notice like SAP, you'll notice Vroom. A lot of technology companies are included that are on the list. In addition to major retail, the reason that you're seeing names like Microsoft, TikTok, Google, eBay, and Sports Illustrated, Discord, Amazon, Pixar, NBC News, almost all of that, Krystal, can be traced back to either too big expansion during the pandemic or artificial intelligence. And I think AI, especially in big tech, is the #1 story because it's not that they don't have the money. They're printing money more than ever before. Their stock prices, like I said, are at record highs, but they're investing specifically in technology which will replace their overall workforce, and they see it as superfluous. You see the same thing actually in some of these news organizations, which is, it's the same problem, and we'll probably do a story about this soon. The mass layoffs in the media industry are about one single thing: the collapse of the original click model. And the reason why that the BuzzFeed model and all that no longer pays is because of a fundamental change in advertising. But what you have seen too, what have those companies done? They're investing in ChatGPT, AI-written articles, because they realize having to pay salary, HR, and all these other benefits for these human beings, which can be relatively easily changed, is one that they're going to make that trade every single day. So I think this is the biggest story in white-collar work. And many people, I think, have a lot of hubris. They're like, well, I got a college degree. I can't be replaced. It's like, well, it turns out a lot of you can.
Yeah.
And, you should really, if you're 18 years old, I urge you to think about this. The physical world is not going anywhere. People will be needing to build things, repair things, HVAC, plumber, trade school, and all that. And if you want to go to college, you better damn well be studying something that cannot be automated out or make yourself indispensable somewhere. Because
and it's honestly difficult to predict.
It's very tough. Who could have said this 5 years ago? Nobody.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the other thing that I'll say is it also shows why it's not just blue collar workers who need worker job protection and unions to be able to advocate for them and to try to, prevent as much as possible the layoffs that we see. White collar workers obviously in need of that as well.
Okay, we have a great guest standing by, Jeff Stein. Let's get to it.
Joining us now to answer what, in theory, should be a simple question is actually a very politically fraught one of how is the economy actually doing is our friend Washington Post economics reporter, Jeff Stein. Great to see you, sir.
Thank you, guys.
Before I jump in, also plug your podcast about John Brown, which is fantastic.
If you guys like Dan Carlin, long-form history podcast, American Radicalism, check out American Carnage. Thank you, everyone from Breaking Points who found the show and listened and subscribed.
Awesome. Rate, subscribe, 5 stars, share with a friend.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I really do encourage it. It's very relevant. I mean, history is always interesting, but relevant to current times as well. All right, so let's put this up on the screen. We had a big jobs report on Friday, some 300,000 plus 353,000 jobs added in January. Of course, the White House is saying, we're back, baby. The economy is actually amazing. We're going to run on it. Americans less certain that they feel so great about the economy. Just give us a sense of how you analyze these numbers and what you think the overall picture of the economy is like right at this moment.
I think it's a little hard to describe the economy without running the risk of sounding like an MSNBC shill.
Well, give us both sides then.
Well, I think from the perspective of the White House, you've had 2 consecutive years of sub 4% unemployment, which is the lowest and the longest consecutive streak below 4% since the 1960s. The job market continues to surpass that of any other major industrial country. You had a recent report with very strong wage gains outpacing inflation for over a year now. You've seen the number of Americans working as a share of the labor force continue to be extremely strong. And yeah, I think that there's really no doubt at this point that the economists like Larry Summers, who were adamant that bringing down inflation would require millions or tens of millions of Americans to lose their jobs, that was just fundamentally wrong. Inflation has come from 9 to 3%. It's not solved. We can get into the rebuttal and the counter argument, but we have seen huge declines in inflation to the point where I don't want to get too into the weeds, but this idea of core PCE inflation, which sort of strips out like volatile measures and looks at like the underlying fundamentals of inflation, those numbers have come down sort of to where they were in 2019, 2018. And that is huge at a time where the economy is adding jobs, where payrolls are continuing to grow, where you're seeing increases in private and public sector employment, retail, white-collar work, manufacturing up to above where it was under Trump, healthcare. All these sectors are growing really fast, and it seems like the investments that the administration made in green energy, in chips, in infrastructure is beginning to really buoy the economy in a very important way. Should I get into the...
Yeah, get on the flip side.
The flip side, I think, is the American public is still catching up to the pain of inflation, and that's probably the number one reason that people still don't give Biden a lot of credit. The hangover from inflation. You may have seen inflation go to 3%, but as you guys know, when you go from 6 to 9 to 3, you're still cumulatively way up from where you were before. And so people don't necessarily measure things in the same time horizons that economists in Washington do. And that is, to my mind, completely rational and completely understandable. You've also seen when the COVID safety net disappeared and the inflation raging at the exact same time, the hardship indicators, and I think this doesn't get nearly enough attention in Washington that's so focused on the labor market, but hunger, poverty, those kind of lack of insurance, the safety net has really frayed in important ways, in ways that contradict the increase in wages that have outpaced inflation. And you've seen, I think, 2022, according to Feeding America, the biggest food bank in America, they said that that 2022 was the biggest spike in hunger in American history. 44% increase in hungry kids. I mean, that is tremendous suffering at the bottom and lower middle class, and a lot of those people are not, some people will say that, look, the middle is doing okay, but the bottom has done very well. And there's some indicators that wages at the very bottom have grown the most. But people who are making 70, 60K a year, who have suffered and have not seen their wages rise on trend with where they were before the pandemic, they are still not like, the rich people. And to say that that's like the privileged of America, I think is really misreading the current moment. So I've filibustered for too long.
No. This is great because that's exactly what I wanted to get to, which is that you have a narrative about how the economy's gotten better. And on paper, people are like, yeah, at least the White House and others. And if you're in the top 25% or whatever, it's probably fair. But then you also have, as you said, sticky inflation. Inflation time horizon extends years. We don't measure prices in quarters. We think about most of our lives for 2% inflation, and then we have 20% inflation. You're like, what the hell happened? So it's one of those where the experience of the economy is different. Now, at the same time, we do see things that are trending up in terms of consumer sentiment and others. So what indicators can we look at for how people who are experiencing the economy feel about the economy going forward and how that's going to impact politics? Because I know the Biden White House is probably tracking that the most closely.
Yeah. I mean, so sentiment, like how people feel about the economy is at a 3-year high, highest it's been since 2021, since before inflation. And that seems to be primarily driven by gas prices staying low and the stock market being high.
Yes.
If you're asking like what is the last mile there for getting people to actually feel good about the economy, we looked at a survey recently that found that the number one reason that people still say that inflation is hurting them is at the grocery store, that they still feel every time they go, and I don't know if you guys do your grocery shopping, but it just feels incredibly random to people where it's like this thing that was like, I remember in my, very recent memory was like $2 and now it's $6, and then it goes down and then something else goes up.
For me, it's chicken. It's like seeing the price, I'm just like, I cannot believe this.
Poultry prices actually were a huge thing that exploded even last year when grocery prices overall plateaued.
Guys, put C3 up on the screen while Jeff is talking about this, because he just had a piece at the Washington Post. The headline is, "Inflation has fallen. Why are groceries still so expensive?" So what did you find there?
Well, what the White House has been saying is that corporate profits continue to rise. We're seeing basically the producer price index, not to get into the weeds of econ talk, but the producer price index, which measures the input costs for firms, has fallen dramatically. And that has not necessarily resulted in consumer prices declining subsequently. And what the White House put out an analysis saying is that corporate profits in this sector are at a 20-year high and remain 2 percentage points higher than they were before the pandemic. And that's a lot of money. That's billions of dollars on the table.
Yeah.
Most economists I talk to will say that the overwhelming driver remains things related to climate change and supply chain shocks. So that's, everything from avian flu, which killed like 80 million birds or something insane. Florida got ravaged by hurricanes and you had like a crippling of citrus production. So there's all these like weird idiosyncratic things, but as long as natural disasters keep striking different parts of the world in weird ways, you're going to have these like weird price volatility in grocery stores. And I think, Saagar, to get back to your point earlier about like how people view the economy, one thing that like economists who are more sympathetic to Biden will say is that people externalize price hikes. They like view those as outside their control, and they internalize wage gains where they're like, I did that, I got that job. Because like, of course, people earn their raises and they feel like they should get credit for them. And I totally don't think that should be taken away from people. But it's also understandable that people don't see that often the same factors that push up inflation are the same reasons that their pay goes up.
That's interesting.
that's a good point.
So they're not like, Joe Biden gave me a raise, which is very understandable. That
Totally.
people would not think of it in that particular way.
No, but it's also like it's a problem for like, as you guys know, there's this school of macroeconomic policymaking that's like taken over the reins of the Democratic Party that said we need massive Keynesian stimulus.
Yes.
And if that leads to a political situation where people are mad because they don't see the inflation as their responsibility and they see the wage gains as something they did, that is an untenable answer politically to the next time we have a recession.
So some of the theories that I have seen of why Joe Biden, I think the latest poll had him at, 36% approval on the economy. He's still dramatically underwater on the economy. People give Donald Trump much higher marks on the economy in terms of his economic stewardship, in spite of, the labor market and the low unemployment rate and the wage gains and even consumer sentiment being at a multi-year high. Here are two theories that I've heard about why that's happening. One of them is it's the media's fault. Like, people are being tricked into thinking the economy is bad because of all the doomerism. A lot of people are saying that.
Can't even get that.
And then the other one is that it actually is just another indicator of people are like, this dude is too old, and I just don't really think he's capable of doing anything. I don't think he's capable of handling the economy. I don't think he's capable of handling foreign policy. I don't think he's capable of like doing a Super Bowl interview. And so the perception, and I would say reality, of him as this, very aged man is weighing even on his economic approval numbers.
I don't want to be too normative or didactic. Like, I don't want to take too firm of a view because I think as a reporter we can like fairly evaluate these kinds of theories and other theories and give them, respect and treat people who are making these arguments take their arguments seriously. But I think I'm one of a few people who has like taken Americans at face value and understood and seen good reason for some of the things that they believe. Like, we had, as Saagar was saying, the fastest inflation in 40 years. And then there's this question of like, why are people upset? Like, their wages were not keeping up with inflation at the worst level that we were seeing in decades. And your point, Krystal, is like, well, if economic sentiment is up, then why isn't that leading to Biden's approval on the economy going up? And someone could throw this back in my face in a few months, but I think with sentiment going up, we're going to see Biden's ratings on the economy also go up. It's still so recent. Like, the increase in consumer sentiment is just a few months old. And it took a very long time for cooling inflation to lead to better sentiment. So it makes perfect sense to me that it will take time for better sentiment to lead to better economic ratings for the president. If they don't, I don't think it's implausible to say, like, maybe like they don't like this guy because he's so old and that's it. Like, that seems like a plausible theory. The idea, I mean, maybe I've been too defensive about this, but what you're alluding to is, there's Will Stancil and others have said, like, it's the fault of the media. You guys hate Biden, and that's the reason people are sour on the economy. And maybe like it's rational for me as a reporter to be like, I'm not responsible for that. But like, at the same time, like, your argument is that the media would have been more friendly to Trump. Like, if inflation had happened under Trump, like,
right,
we would have been I don't know. That is hard for me to countenance, but some people argue it.
Yeah, that
Excellent
is a great point.
Yeah, excellent points, Jeff. It's always great talking to you, man. Everybody go and subscribe to his John Brown podcast, and thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Great to see you, Jeff.
Thanks so much, guys.
All right, guys, a stunning admission on Sunday TV this weekend when former CENTCOM commander General Frank McKenzie made this revelation about how the Israeli operation is going in Gaza. Take a listen.
U.S. intelligence estimates Israeli forces have killed about 20 to 30% of Hamas fighters since October. That is far short of destroying Hamas. How do you judge the level of success of Israel's campaign?
It's very limited so far. I think they set themselves a goal of removing the political echelon and the military leadership echelon of Hamas when they went in. They have not been successful to date at doing either. And these campaigns are nonlinear, so they don't necessarily go from day to day. You could have a big breakthrough here, and things could change suddenly on the ground. But I think the larger issue, at least for me, looking at it is you have to have a theory for what it's going to look like when it's over. What's going to happen in Gaza, and we've had some people that have talked about it earlier on the show today. And I think it's important to consider that. You need a vision of an end state when you begin a military campaign, because everything you do then subtracts or adds to your ability to get to that point. And I would argue that needs to be something like a two-state solution. You're going to need help from the Arab nations in the region to go in there and do something in Gaza. I think Israeli occupation would be the least desirable of all outcomes.
So just think about that, what he's saying. He says their success, military success, is, quote, very limited so far. This in spite of the fact that somewhere around 30,000 Palestinians have been killed. The bombing campaign has been more devastating than historic, devastating campaigns like Dresden. A majority of buildings in all of Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. And yet, in spite of all of that, their actual stated objectives, which, as I have talked about many times, do not appear to be the real objectives of the operation. But in terms of the stated objectives, the success has been, quote, very limited so far.
Yeah, it's really crazy. And in terms of the overall U.S. military, we have some crazy new reporting from Ken Klippenstein and our own Ryan Grimm. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. It appears, Krystal, that the White House falsely said that it had warned the government of Iraq of impending airstrikes. The reason that this is very important is, number one, they lied and they straight up said at the press conference that they had done it. And then only later on did they claim, quote, for operational security, we did not provide any official pre-notification with specific detail on these strikes. The reason why this is really important, beyond the fact that our government just straight up lies to us about whenever they bomb countries, is that many of, and this is part of the even crazier political element to this, the groups which bombed and helped kill these Americans, many of them are officially part of the Iraqi government. And in fact, the Iraqi prime minister has been visiting militia members who were wounded in U.S. airstrikes in the hospital, just to show you the level of convoluting here, because he has deep ties to Iran, and the Iranian militias have run the country now for 20-some years. It's been an incredibly important, aspect of that. But it just gets to some of the craziness. Right now, the Biden administration is engaged with the Iraqi government to keep our troops in the country. So at the very same moment that we are bombing said country and bombing elements of that country which have ties to that government, we are also trying to keep our troops in that country, all because of a war in Gaza. Make it make sense to me.
It doesn't.
Somebody
and they
please
know it
make
doesn't
it make sense. Of course, because when you explain it, people are like, what? What are you talking about? But they don't want you to know. They don't want people to ask any questions about this. They just assume you can drop bombs on, there was a time when I was a child where we actually weren't bombing anybody. It was, it's interesting to consider. It's only a very modern phenomenon where these things just happen and people die in a far-flung place and you go, what were they doing over there? And then you go back to watching The Simpsons or whatever and you just forget that it happened.
And the U.S. government can't even really tell you why they're there or what they're doing. And consider, not to go back to the Iraq War, but consider the utter failure of the, real goals of that war, which was in part to serve as a check on Iran. And now Iran is basically running the country.
Basically, they are running the country.
So great job on that one. Once again, guys, way to go. You really did what you, meant to do and meant to accomplish there. And that's the part that just drives me insane is they know that there is no military solution to Hamas. They know that these strikes are not going to do a damn thing to deter these militias, to keep our service members safe.
They know all of that, and yet they do it anyway. They know that the only way that tensions actually de-escalate in the region and can return to some sense of normalcy and stability is through a ceasefire in Gaza. And yet instead they pursue this policy of just like sporadic bombing and, apparently lying to the American people about what they're doing and who they told about it. Reuters confirmed, we can put this up on the screen, that the U.S. did not give pre-notification to Iraq ahead of strikes. This reporter from Reuters says, hey, this is directly contradicting what the White House said on record on Friday, that the Biden administration did indeed notify the Iraqis ahead of time. And put the next one up on the screen as well, to the point of they know that this isn't going to work, that it's not going to deter anyone or keep any of our service members safe. The Iran-backed groups have continued to target American bases as the U.S. plans further strikes. And yet these are the same people, Saagar, who want to tell us that, it hasn't spread into a wider war. It's still contained in Gaza as we literally bomb and, take incoming in 3 different countries. It's just, it's absolutely preposterous. So a U.S. military official confirmed there were fatalities from an attack on the Al Omar oil field, part of a complex that includes a U.S. base and is jointly controlled with the American military. Those casualties were not Americans. They were some allied militias that took that incoming and, suffered fatalities from these attacks. Syrian Democratic Forces, U.S. allied Kurdish militia, said 6 of their fighters had died in that drone strike on Al Omar. So the bottom line is here. We've seen more than 165 attacks on American bases with rockets, missiles, drones, or mortars since October 7th. As I've said 100 times, the only time when these attacks stopped was when there was a ceasefire. For 6 days, when there was a ceasefire, these attacks stopped. And the Houthis all but stopped what they were doing on the Red Sea as well. It is plain as day what the correct strategy is here to protect our service members and to actually achieve de-escalation in the region, and yet they refuse to actually pursue the policies that would lead in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, it's stunning whenever you read this because it just shows that the expansion is likely. Also, increasingly, unfortunately, we're only paying attention when people get killed. And obviously we should pay attention. But there are a lot of these service members who have been wounded, who have suffered traumatic brain injuries. Also, these Syrians, they were under our protection.
Yeah,
just so everybody knows. They were on an American airbase, and 6 of them died. I mean, you should think our troops are not that far away. It's probably a miracle that our people didn't get killed in that attack. And no one can answer this question. Why are they there in the first place? Why are they sitting ducks? The Iranians have the luxury of being able to move about the country as they please and go back to their country if they want to. Our people are sitting on the same base with no change in strategy, a government that is lying to their own people. And, even the troops there, how could you have any confidence in the Biden administration right now?
Oh, yeah.
After what's happening, I cannot tell you how badly I feel for them to just be sitting there, without the support that you need, a populace which is basically distracted as to your plight. And of course, as we said, it all comes back to Gaza. At the same time, let's put this up there on the screen. Netanyahu saying that the war in Gaza will not be over before the killing of Hamas leadership, quote unquote, stressing it will take another few months. So doubling down on the strategy, Krystal, and really, I think they're coming under intense military pressure, maybe at home. You can tell me if I'm wrong. They're like, hey, you said you're going to kill the Hamas leadership. You haven't killed the Hamas leadership. You haven't, what's his name? Sinwar.
Sinwar.
He remains inside these tunnels, surrounded by hostages, allegedly by the Israelis. It's like, well, if you know where he is, what are you going to do about it?
Right.
And then it comes to the question of, well, clearly you've been doing this now for it's February 6th. So tomorrow is the 4-month anniversary, I believe, of the attack. So it's a quarter of a year that we've had this happen. And you haven't been able to, with the world's most advanced technology and a ground invasion and all that, you haven't rescued a single hostage. So what are you going to do about it? The hostage situation now is almost certainly going to be resolved through maybe ceasefire negotiation. It remains up in the air as of today. Secretary Blinken met with MBS yesterday, but that's all the progress that we have so far.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this cuts against the idea of a ceasefire being negotiated right now. As we covered yesterday, Netanyahu is under intense pressure from the far right, Ben Gvir and Smotriches of his coalition, who are threatening to blow the whole thing up, blow up his entire governing coalition if he were to take some sort of deal of the type that Hamas will be willing to accept. The more quote-unquote moderate parts of his coalition are on the other side of that. So he is, being pulled in both directions. And outside of his own ideology, which has been very clear over time, his number one interest is in his own political self-preservation, which again cuts in the direction of, placating the right, keeping that coalition together, trying to keep the war going for as long as possible. And in lieu of achieving actual military success, bringing to the people these images of horror and destruction in an attempt to cover for the fact that the goals they claim to support of destroying Hamas are never going to be achieved. Even if they get Sinwar ultimately, which may happen, I don't know. The actual goal of eradicating Hamas was always a fantasy from day one, something we've been talking about the entire time.
It's not difficult to predict.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the same time, there was one other aspect of that border Ukraine-Israel bill that we wanted to dig into with regard to Israel, which is that the bill officially permanently cuts aid to UNRWA, which is the primary humanitarian organization to the benefit of Palestinians, not just in Gaza and not even just in the West Bank, but the entire Palestinian diaspora around the region. Can put this up on the screen. It has the text of the bill. So the commentary here is bipartisan border Israel-Ukraine package blocks all funding for UNRWA from the U.S., its biggest donor. Let me read you the text. It says, none of the funds appropriated or otherwise made available by this division and Division B of this act and prior acts, blah, 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 may be made available for a contribution grant or other payment to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, otherwise known as UNRWA, notwithstanding any other provision of law. So you will recall that on the very day that the ICJ, relying in part on some of the testimony and some of the analysis of UNRWA officials, when they ruled that Israel may be plausibly committing genocide, on that very day, the U.S. suddenly jumped to and said, oh, we received these quote-unquote highly credible allegations about a dozen UNRWA employees out of, I think, 30,000 participating in October 7th, allegedly. And they described this as, intelligence that they got from the Israelis that was highly credible. Okay. So on the very day that the ICJ says we need to increase humanitarian aid to the Gaza population, which is literally starving to death, we, the main backer of UNRWA, pull our funding, and that triggers a cascading effect where some 13 other countries or something cut their funding as well, dramatically dealing a blow that will further starve and impoverish the Palestinian population in Gaza. So I actually was able to look at the allegations that were made by the Israelis. A source sent me a copy of what has been passed around to various news outlets like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal that they just out and out run with. It is incredible to me. Like, I didn't think I could be shocked by this, Saagar, but it is actually incredible because it is literally just a evidence-free list of allegations. Literally like a list of names and this person did that and that person did that. And they say, oh, it's based on identification cards and other intelligence. But no actual evidence is provided. Now, maybe they did participate and maybe they didn't. I can tell you there's definitely not enough that has been provided to say anything about this. Again, zero evidence provided. But second of all, these people have already been fired just based on the allegations. And so they are collectively punishing the entire Palestinian population over evidence-free allegations against a tiny handful of employees of a large organization. Is truly stunning. At the same time, the State Department spokesperson yesterday was pressed on the funding of UNRWA and is using this text in the bill, which hasn't even been passed yet, in an attempt to justify their cutting of the aid to this vital humanitarian organization. Let's take a listen to that.
Obviously, there is text in this pending legislation that would preclude us from doing so. Right. We are an administration that follows the law. Right. That being said, in this pending legislation, there is $10 billion for humanitarian assistance, right, of which $1.4 billion is for humanitarian aid for Gaza. This is an issue we take very seriously. We also believe, even prior to this conversation about the supplemental, we have, as I told Simon, been unambiguous, in my opinion, about the critical work that UNRWA does, not just in Gaza, but in other parts of the region as well.
So amazingly, he says, oh, we're an administration that follows the law, which, by the way, is a complete lie. When it comes to Israel, they just do whatever they want, clearly. Or when it comes to bombing random countries, they clearly do whatever they want. They do not follow the law. But also, again, this bill hasn't even passed yet, and they're using it as some kind of cover to justify their unilateral decision based on zero evidence to cut funding to this agency.
Yeah, Krystal, after reviewing the dossier, which you so graciously helped share with us and that we can provide for everybody else, I just want to say, like, you're really not exaggerating. I will not read, because there's some identifying details, but they literally just say, quote unquote, was a Hamas operative. He entered Israeli territory on 7/10 and participated in actions. That's it. Right. I just read a direct quote.
There's
about
no like
an individual.
Photographs or here's
right.
the
exactly
cell phone
yes.
Literally nothing. Right. I mean, not even on the level of, remember those supposed audio intercepts that were so laughably fictitious that they would start. Nothing. It's just so and so did X. Baseless, no evidence, nothing. I truly am stunned by it. Not because I don't put it past the Israeli government. And I guess I shouldn't have any sort of expectation for our news outlets at this point. But both the New York Times and Wall Street Journal just ran with this. Zero evidence. I mean, we're just, YouTubers over here, podcasters, and we would never run with something that had no basis whatsoever other than the Israeli government says XYZ.
No, you're absolutely right. It doesn't fit that editorial standard at all. And it just goes back to a question about just straight up belief. And also why, you have to evaluate what people are saying. And you have to see, you can't just take their word for it just because, you may be friends with them, or in the Wall Street Journal's case, you may have once been a soldier for them. It's some interesting questions too about the people who are reporting this stuff and about their own, some scrutiny in their own background. Which, look, if you are from Israel or whatever, that's fine, but it should probably be disclosed, no? Like in the report, if you're going to pass off something as exclusive, and then in terms of the evidence, not provide any within that, especially when it has major humanitarian ramifications. And that's something that we could put the fourth element, please, up on the screen. That was something that the head of the World Food Program, who, by the way, is Cindy McCain, just a note, in terms of our former, most pro-Israel senator in human history.
Yeah, I also want to know what her conversations with her daughter are like these days.
Yeah, I would be curious. She says, quote, no other entity currently has the capacity to deliver the scale and breadth of assistance the 2.2 million in Gaza urgently need. Withdrawing money from UNRWA is perilous. We appeal for these decisions to be reconsidered. I found that interesting just because she technically is part of the Biden administration, was appointed by the president to the World Food Program. So there does seem to be, maybe at least consternation amongst the people who actually work in the space, as opposed to people who are looking at this purely in political terms.
Yeah,
that's probably what it is.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. I just so you know, it's not just us saying that there's no evidence. Put this up on the screen from the Financial Times. This is a quote from them. Israel had not presented any evidence of its allegations to UNRWA, adding the UN agency had been forced to respond to leaks in the media of an Israeli intelligence assessment that at least 12 of its Palestinian employees had taken part in the Hamas raid. These included one accused of kidnapping a woman and another said to have seized the body of a slain soldier. The intelligence assessment, which has been seen by the FT, provides no evidence for the claims, which it says are based on smartphone intercepts and captured identity cards. But the U.S. has said it found them highly credible. And then we have one more element that we can put up here from Owen Jones, but breaking down a Sky News report. We were told originally there were 12 UNRWA employees out of 30,000 involved in October 7th. Now it's down to 6. And Sky News reports that the Israeli intelligence documents make several claims without proof, and many claims do not directly implicate UNRWA anyway. I can read a little bit of this Sky News report. They say that many of the claims have no evidence, has not seen proof of, and many of the claims, even if true, do not directly implicate UNRWA. The agency also never received any concerns about their staff members, and they are required, UNRWA is, to share a list of their staff with Israel every single year, and Israel never raised any concerns about any of these staff members. In addition, it's worth noting, UNRWA, as they write in Sky News, has paid a heavy price during the war. 152 of their staff have been killed in Gaza, and 145 of their facilities have been damaged. It's important to keep in mind, as we go through these claims against UNRWA, that Netanyahu and the right, but many other sectors of Israeli society have long had their sights set on the destruction of UNRWA, because they believe, since UNRWA, their mission is to, serve, they do schools and, aid and humanitarian assistance to Palestinian refugees wherever they are, that they basically keep the Palestinians from giving up on their claims to any of the land. And so they've long wanted to destroy UNRWA because they just disagree centrally with that mission, and they think they sort of keep the problem alive and keep Palestinians from ultimately giving up. So that's also the context for these claims that are being made.
The context is important because UNRWA has been largely, in general, the Israelis, what is smart is that you want to attack anybody who is counter-narrative and showing people what you're doing so that you don't have a complete monopoly on information from the situation, and you don't have a monopoly on media coverage, et cetera. So you attack the people and the credibility of those who are against you. UNRWA has been a major, major party, which has been very counter to many of the Israeli claims about civilian casualties, et cetera. So what do? You go after them. But overall, what I would really say is that this is the bigger media story to me, because the U.S. government clearly did not do any due diligence that was based on this. They provided no evidence, and it's up to the media, Wall Street Journal and others. I already see, Ben Shapiro out there being like, UNRWA's full of terrorists and all those other things. As you said, we're not going to sit here and be like, it's not possible. It's certainly possible. You just need evidence whenever you're going to support a claim, which also has a secondary organization with an aim that is overall humanitarian and clearly is undermining at a strategic level the Israeli government. So we should just treat that with skepticism. To me, this is a massive media story. That the fact that the U.S. press, and why is look, it's not like the British aren't pro-Israel. Why is their press just willing to employ basic journalistic standards? The FT, great paper, is just like, yeah, I don't see it. Channel 4, same thing. But listen, they're not liberal by any means. They're just like, I don't see the evidence here. This is the dossier. It wasn't that hard, Krystal, like you said, for us to get our hands on it and just look at it and be like,
it's literally a page long. That's it. There's nothing provided with it.
Look, when I was a political White House journalist, I was provided with these fake dossiers all the time. I never printed them once, ever, because I was like, this is just propaganda. You have to check it. You just have to be like, okay, he said this. So you call the guy and you're like, hey, is this what actually happened? And 9 out of 10 times, they'll be like, no, that's a total misrepresentation about what is happening.
Well, and it's not like UNRWA, probably really kind of unfairly, given that no evidence was provided, but they just immediately fired these people because of the gravity of even the allegations. Yeah. So it's also like, what do you even want them to do? And the Israeli government also, they said, hasn't shared with them any of the purported evidence. So they've already fired the people. The UN has undertaken an investigation to see if there's any there. They've already said if there's grounds for prosecution, they will be prosecuted. So it's also like, what else do you want them to do? And why does it make sense to collectively punish not just this entire organization, but the entirety of the Palestinian people on the alleged actions, evidence-free allegations, but alleged actions of 6 UNRWA employees or a dozen UNRWA employees or whatever? It really is outrageous. And the last thing I'll say about the timing, because the timing is so critical here that it came on the same day as the ICJ ruling of plausible genocide, it's also punishment for the fact that UNRWA analysts and employees and staff members were quoted and were used in order to achieve that plausible genocide ruling. So there's also a direct line between the fact that they were quoted in the report, in the ruling, and that they were attacked on that very day. I don't think that those two things are a coincidence. I think it's direct retaliation for the fact that they were cited at all in the judge's ruling there at the ICJ.
You're very likely correct. All right, guys, we had a great show today. Thank you so much for supporting us. We had that RFK Jr. focus group, as we mentioned. We'll have a great Counterpoint show for everyone tomorrow. Hopefully, Krystal and I's throats are gonna
take a little.
This has been rough here. I'm not gonna lie. I need a break here. I'm gonna let Emily speak.
Thanks for bearing with us, guys. As
we're trying our best. As you can see, we do work through sickness, as you can see here over at Breaking Points, and we'll have a great show for everybody on Thursday.